Hello and welcome to everyone to this exploratory workshop, which will be looking at the work of Pierre Hadot and the decolonial study of Islam, particularly of Islamic thought. It's something which came out of conversations that I was having with Michael Chase, who is at Sina in Paris, and the person who's probably translated most of Hadot's corpus into English, and he's also a specialist on ancient philosophy and increasingly on early Islamic philosophy. What I think I'll do is I'll pass it to him to say a few words about why we thought we wanted to do this, and then I'll say a few words as introduction, and then after that initial sort of 15 minutes or so, then we'll begin the workshop proper with the first paper, which again actually will be Mike presenting some ideas. All of the papers, by the way, are fairly preliminary. I've asked a number of people to speak for up to 20 minutes on their research and how it engages with and interacts with this topic, with this theme. And then we'll sort of see how the conversation goes. There should be enough time. There'll be about 10 minutes after each presentation for conversation. And at the end, I've asked Nusa Basman to maybe sort of bring things together with some reflections that she has on what's been going on. What I'll also do is I'll introduce each speaker just before they start. Either Mike or myself will introduce the speakers. Okay, so let's begin with why we wanted to do this workshop. So over to you, Mike.
Yes, thanks so much, Sajjad, and welcome everyone. I really want to thank Sajjad for his extraordinary generosity and efficacy in organizing this workshop. A couple of words about why I wanted to do this. I think that now that it's been about 25 years since the first English translation of one of Hadot's works, Hadot's thought has entered into the academic mainstream, and it's been used in a multidisciplinary, pluridisciplinary way to, as several publications have shown. However, there's also been a recent tendency on the part of thinkers on the right of the political spectrum, one might put it crudely that way, to interpret Hadot as a conservative, if not a reactionary thinker. And now who simply is against everything that smacks of postmodernism and wants to go back to recommending the reading of the canon of dead white men. Now, I want to react against that reading. I want to push back against it. I don't think that, not only is that not the only way to read Hadot, I believe, I don't think it's a legitimate way to read Hadot. And I think that all of the eminent scholars that we've been fortunate enough to have on board today will, I think, tend to reinforce this view that Hadot doesn't have to be read that way and can, in fact, be used in a new and fruitful way to study new questions. Now, as far as I know, this is the first meeting ever to examine the question of Hadot's relationship to decoloniality. And I hope, along with Sajjad, that it might not be the last. So once again, welcome aboard and thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you, Mike. I've also got a few observations. I might take a few more minutes than Mike, just to say something about my own interaction with this. So as Mike was saying, the first translations, which of course were his, came out in about 95. I first came across Hadot's work in about 96, when I was starting out as a doctoral student, as I'm sure a number of you here are. You know how it is, you're kind of sitting in the library, you find something, although of course nowadays you can't do that anymore. I guess this browsing in stacks is not a thing anymore, but hopefully it will be soon. And I think I was one of the first people to write something about how you bring Hadot into conversation with Islamic. I published an article about 7 years ago, I think now, on using bringing Hadot into conversation with Mullah Sa'd al-Shirazi, who's a 17th century philosopher who I personally work on. The other reason, of course, for bringing this together is I'm increasingly quite interested in this paradigm of decoloniality and what it means and how we should be applying it, trying to make sense of it for the study of Islam and particularly of Islamic thought. So those are the two main reasons why I thought this would be useful to do as well. Now, I'm not going to say much about why Hadot, because if you want, I can refer you to that article I wrote a while ago, which goes through some of the reasons why I think it's useful to look at Hadot. But for me, there's two things which perhaps I should stress now more than ever. One is the particular approach he takes to the category of philosophy, which I think in Islamic philosophy or Arabic philosophy, as some people prefer to call it, is increasingly being debated. And this is this very notion of what we mean by philosophy. Is philosophy something which is narrowly Aristotelian, which is based on a certain structure of logic and argumentation, or is it something much broader? Is it a particular ascesis? Is it a way of life, as Hadot suggests? That I think is an important question. Associated with that is this issue of how we engage with texts in the past and also how we engage with some pioneers in the field. So for me, the question of how we, in a sense, wrest Hadot away from the right is a bit like how we do the same thing with someone who, for me, is very important, who is Henri Corbin, who in many ways was the pioneer of Islamic philosophy, and particularly of philosophy in the later period. There's someone in background noise coming in. If people could mute themselves, okay. Right. So this question of how we engage with Pierre Hadot's work is a bit similar to how we might engage with someone like Henri Corbin in similar ways, and how he deals with the question of tradition and how he deals with authority within that. And related to that, I think, is this wider problem that we have in the study of Islam and especially of Islamic philosophy, that not only are certain categories taken in a very narrow, are taken to mean rather narrow things such as philosophy, but there's sort of wider, remnant tendencies which I would broadly describe as Orientalist with respect to the study of Islam. By that, I mean there's an over-textualist emphasis, there is a rather Arabocentric emphasis, there is a tendency to essentializing categories and thinking that categories and conceptual frameworks are relatively stable and do not shift. And then this wider sort of issue of how do we understand the genealogy of a term such as Islam and the various categories associated with that. So I think there is, this has been ongoing at least I'd say for the last 10 years, a rethinking of how we study Islam and look at the categories involved in that, how we take seriously the embodiment of the study of Islam, both ourselves as investigators, as researchers in the field, but also with respect to the practices, whether they're reading practices or other kinds of practices that we observe, that we are studying ourselves. And alongside that, there are two other kind of elements of that rather stale approach to Islam, which assumes not only certain master narratives or hegemonic ways of looking at Islam, but also tends to deal in a number of binaries. So one of the classic binaries is religion versus culture. Another classic binary is reason versus affect, if you will. Another binary is, sort of textual versus folk religion or popular religion, as it's sometimes called. Good Muslim, bad Muslim. If you look at categories within, Zahir Batin, sort of exterior, interior, gender categories, and others sort of which you might consider to be of political persuasion, such as liberal and conservative. And I think these are somewhat problematic in a number of ways to study Islam. And they are all precisely ways which I think decoloniality seeks to overcome. So let me just say a couple of things quickly about decoloniality. Although of course there are others on this call who are far better versed in it than I am. But we'll of course open up the discussion. Let me just say one thing about what I think decoloniality is not, and then a couple of things about what I think it is. So decoloniality is not just about something which is suddenly trendy in academia, right? It's not just kind of the way in which the left embeds itself and indoctrinates you, especially those of you who are students, so that you can then pass on that indoctrination to the next generation. It's not about canceling certain authors, right? It's not about saying we have to stop reading Kant or Hegel or Heidegger or whoever because they had such and such views, but it's rather about opening up possibilities, about options, about new readings, and about reflecting upon who we are. It's not just about retrenching the authority of native or local knowledge. It's not nativism. It's not saying, let's get rid of these theoretical frameworks to study Islam and let's see what Muslims themselves say, and that is always correct and it will always be authoritative within its context. And fundamentally, it's not about replacing one hegemonic way of looking at Islam with another hegemonic way of looking at Islam. It's really about opening up the option. So in terms of what is perhaps a positive definition of decoloniality, I'll say three things. One is with respect to ontology. It's about the positionality of the subject, the nature of the inquiry, and the self-reflection of the person who's engaged in the inquiry. So if you are the researcher, it's about reflecting upon who you are and how your position affects the research that you're doing and reflecting upon that. And this is the case not just for example, anthropologists in the field. We tend to, this is another kind of binary which I think is problematic, which often happens in the field. We separate those who study texts from those who study humans and assume that those who study texts are somewhat disembodied and kind of out there in the world of ideas, whereas humans are those who kind of, those studying humans are kind of in the field. That's not true. We're both engaged with human subjects. We're both engaged in a particular field. We both have a particular context, which is important to consider. And we need to consider the different ways in which we deal with temporality, the different ways in which we deal with the present, future possibilities, and also how we engage with the past, and the presences and the remnants and the traces of the past that we are engaged with, particularly those of us who might be historians. So there's issues around ontology, which are extremely significant to be reflected upon that. There's issues around epistemology. So as I said, it's really about kind of overcoming certain binary categories and dealing with categories as if they're fixed and indeterminate. It's about going beyond certain master narratives. It's to a certain extent about decentering Europe. This doesn't mean you jettison Europe. For those of you who have read, for example, Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, he extensively uses Heidegger, right? Now, some people might say, oh, you know, that's not really decolonial because you're still using elements of the so-called Western canon. But the point about decoloniality with respect to epistemology has always been that it's not about getting rid of a whole body of literature, but it's rather about reading critically within bodies of literature. It's about finding voices which can come together with the ones that you're interested in to construct a certain narrative and consider certain ways of looking at thought and life and embedded experiences. And the important thing about the epistemology also is that it's to deal with what has happened through coloniality. So one of the elements which we'll come back to about coloniality is the way in which it has affected, in many ways, an epistemicide. It's affected, it's destroyed archives, it's destroyed ways of doing things. It's destroyed knowledge networks. Again, if I can ask those of you who are not, can you please, yeah, okay, cool, thank you. It's about, where was I? Yes, dealing with the question of epistemicide. So it's about trying to see how we can repair that epistemicide through the sorts of inquiries that we are making, right? And that brings me to the last point, which is about decoloniality. For me, is about the future. It's about options of how you move forward. It's about once we've made a certain diagnosis of coloniality, we've recognized the questions of our ontology as well as our practice, including the epistemology. Then the question is, how do we repair it? How do we move forward? And that's really the key issue. That's basically what everyone's speaking about and talking about. How do we bring different modes of inquiry, archives, methods in conversation with each other to open up possibilities of looking at the future, right? And in ways which don't necessarily have to be extremely hierarchical, extremely adversarial. One of the problems sometimes is that some of these debates have become extremely adversarial. Sort of saying a wholesale rejection of, say, a body of literature. I don't think that's what the more sensible people who work in decoloniality do at all. It's often what we are accused of doing. We're accused of being kind of these radical, intellectual terrorists, right? But that's not really what it's about. It's about what options do we have. The term which someone like Arturo Escobar uses is what pluriversal options do we have? How do we look at the universe in its plurality and diversity? And how do we think about methodologies with respect to diversity? And this is extremely important precisely because we live in a world, we live in academic contexts which are diverse, and we have to see how we can, in a sense, foster that diversity, but also harness that diversity to think about ways forward in terms of academic exercises and to recognize, I think, fundamentally that academic research actually does matter. The research in the humanities is not something which is divorced from who we are or our context. All of us, our students, our colleagues, we live in this world, and what we study affects people. The study of Islam is something which affects the lives of billions of people around the world, right? It is important. It's not something which is merely a nice, cozy debate over coffee or something merely for the classroom. It actually has significance in the wider world. And so the ways in which we speak about it will have a significance. So if we can actually foster new, interesting, innovative options to how we do this within the classroom and then kind of affect the wider society, wonderful. Because, without sounding really cheesy, I think academia is about trying to change the world and change society and change the way in which we engage with one another. So after that kind of pep talk, let me pass you back to Mike, who will, Michael Chase, who will begin with the first talk. And then I said, we'll have a bit of time after each talk for some discussion, and I will then introduce the next speaker after that. So Mike, over to you. Sorry for going over slightly.
Sajjad, thank you so much for that extremely eloquent presentation, which I think will render a large part of my talk obsolete, but that's okay. That's the way science makes progress. That's the way scholarship makes progress. So I want to talk in my somewhat pretentiously titled presentation about Pierre Hadot and decoloniality, prolegomena to a new field of study. So what do we mean when we talk about Pierre Hadot and decoloniality? In a sense, it's anachronistic because Pierre Hadot himself would no doubt have looked at us quizzically if we talked to him about decoloniality. He would not have known, I think, what the term means. He died in 2010, after all. Hadot himself was somewhat reticent with regard to comparative scholarship for most of his life, although near the end of his life, he began to find some, what he thought were some interesting parallels between certain aspects.
Mike, sorry for disturbing you. Can you put it in slideshow mode? It's just that.
I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. My mistake. Of course. There we go. Sorry about that. So anyway, yes, Hadot found near the end of his life some interesting parallels, what he thought were interesting parallels between Greco-Roman spiritual exercises and some Eastern traditions, Zen Buddhism, Chinese Taoism, but these tendencies were cut short by his death. So now, 26 years after the publication of Philosophy as a Way of Life, we have seen that it is now become an established part of academia, the Hadotian approach. It's been equally influential, however, outside of academia in fields such as practical philosophy, philosophical counseling, business studies, management, a wide variety of disciplines. On the other hand, Hadot's work on Marcus Aurelius was one of the guiding forces behind what's now known as the Neo-Stoic movement, which has become something of a growth industry with its podcasts, self-help manuals, colloquia, and a Stoicism Facebook group, which the last time I checked had over 80,000 members worldwide. What are some of the more influential aspects of Hadot's thought? Well, if I had to choose, I would choose his view that philosophy consists primarily in spiritual exercises, which are intended to facilitate a transformation of the individual's mode of looking at the world, and thereby a transformation of her being. So instead of a method for solving problems or constructing arguments by means of an exclusively rational methodologically, as is the standard definition of philosophy, at least in Anglo-Saxon lands, Hadot famously claimed that philosophy was a way of life. And his goal, once again, was to enable practitioners to become less anxious, less worried, and less distracted in order to be able to lead a life characterized by more happiness, autonomy, and authenticity. Hadot went so far as to say that the assiduous practice of spiritual exercises could increase not just the quality, but also the intensity of our mode of being in the world. Now, of course, not everyone agrees with Hadot's analyses. Some have countered that what Hadot is doing is not really philosophy at all. It's some kind of spiritualistic, mystical mumbo jumbo. For some, his emphasis on the priority of spiritual exercises and the secondary or even epiphenomenal role of rational arguments used to justify them is anathema to many professional philosophers, and it's what disqualifies him, in the view of many, as a philosopher himself. Some Christians have taken umbrage at Hadot's idea that that it was mainly Christianity, the rise of Christianity and its subordination of philosophy to theology, which was largely responsible for the eclipse of philosophy as a way of life. Others have resorted to ad hominem attacks. Since Hadot was a former priest, they say what he's actually doing is to promote some kind of a crypto-religious mysticism disguised as philosophy. Some have claimed that Hadot is in fact a crypto-Hegelian because he talks about uniting with the objective spirit, quote unquote. And finally, not a few contemporary professional philosophers are upset by Hadot's description of contemporary philosophy departments as mere factories for producing more professors of philosophy. To go briefly over the grande ligne of Hadot's approach to philosophy, he believes that what we call philosophy was not in the past and should not be today restricted to the writing and publication of articles in specialized journals, nor should it be the exclusive purview of those who make their living as philosophers. Although, as I mentioned before, the practical and theoretical aspects of philosophy are complementary and thus indissociable, there is still a primacy of the concrete practical exercises Hadot calls spiritual. Now, these are exercises that mobilize not just reason, but also emotion and the imagination. And they aim at enabling the practitioner to achieve a gradual moral progress, eventually leading to increased happiness. And Hadot himself has qualified this, this attitude of his as ethical perfectionism. Now, I think the basic premise underlying all Hadot's thought is his idea that the main source of our unhappiness is our view that the world revolves around our individual isolated self. This view, according to Hadot, makes us become so absorbed in our regrets about the past and our fears about the future that we neglect to actually live, to enjoy the boundless pleasures that each unique instant of life has to offer. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, Hadot's philosophy as a whole, Hadot's approach, has been subject to a wide variety of interpretations. And recently, it has been taken, his criticisms of academia have been taken as a denunciation of continental philosophy, studies of gender and race, and quote unquote wokeness in general. Of course, he would not have understood that term either, because it's just been invented over the past few years by right-wing pundits. Now, these conservative interpreters take him to be a reactionary thinker, as I mentioned. And I believe this is perhaps not a totally unrelated aspect, is that some neo-Stoics have followed Hadot's interpretation of Marcus Aurelius, but whereas Hadot pointed to the fact that Marcus was working with a triple discipline of logic, physics, and ethics, these interpreters amputate Stoicism of its physical and ethical social aspects, thereby transforming Stoicism into some kind of a crude libertarianism, which boils down to the view that I have the right to think and do whatever I want, and I don't have to care about what anyone else says. Anybody who's had a teenager will recognize talk like that. Nobody has the right to tell me what to do. Slam goes the bedroom door. Now, in the case of certain so-called neo-Stoics, some of them have made a lucrative living out of this interpretation. People like Jordan Peterson, for instance, who has used it to construct his own misogynistic reactionary philosophy, which has made him mountains of cash, made him the patron saint of the incel movement, and a source of inspiration for Islamophobic tendencies worldwide. I feel sure that Hadot would have repudiated this interpretation lock, stock, and barrel. But Hadot's thought doesn't have to be interpreted this way. This has been shown by the volume to which Sajjad contributed. We published about 10 years ago. It's been shown by a similarly themed recent volume edited by Mohammed Azadpour, whom we have the pleasure of having with us today. And it's shown by the fact that, once again, that one of Hadot's main goals was to democratize the practice of philosophy, making it available not just to people who have the training to be able to read technical philosophical journals, but to everybody interested in transforming themselves. And along these lines, I think it's important to point out that one contributing factor to Hadot's success is his style. The simplicity of his style, his avoidance of specialized jargon. Generally speaking, there are exceptions. But I want to argue in what follows that this distaste for jargon, which separates Hadot, which is one of the things he objected to in some contemporary postmodern French thinkers of the Derrida Foucault variety, is a theme that we also find taken up in some of the later writings of Edward Said. Now, one of the key ideas underlying Hadot's notion is the importance of perspective or viewpoint. Hadot believes that if most of us are unhappy most of the time, one main reason is that we have an erroneous viewpoint on things, events, life, and the world. We think we're isolated individuals without any necessary connection to other human beings or the world in which we live. And the result is that we evaluate things, events, and so forth as a function of whether or not they seem potentially beneficial or dangerous to us. When I deem certain things good or beautiful, what I really mean, says Hadot, is that I think they seem good, beneficial, profitable, or advantageous to me. Same holds true for my regrets about the past, my hopes and desires concerning the future. It's all about me. generally speaking. But here, the me in question is that limited time and space-bound bundle of emotions, thoughts, memories, likes and dislikes, which we naturally and unreflectively, as it were, tend to identify as ourselves. But Hadot believes that this excessive focalization on ourselves, quote unquote, is not only the cause of many of our problems, but it's also a mistake. This default self, which we identify by rapid introspection, is not our only self, according to Hadot, and it's not even our real self. Our real self, he believes, is something higher and deeper that is constantly aware of its connection with other human beings, living beings, and the cosmos as a whole. Realizing this identity requires us that we redefine the self, expanding its narrow limits and beginning to identify with a self, capital S, that is more universal, objective, and authentic. And this is what Hadot means when he speaks about the goal of spiritual exercises as being cosmic consciousness. Now, a side effect, a byproduct of this process of redefinition, is increased happiness. Hadot simply believes that it's an empirical fact that people who no longer identify exclusively with their circumscribed, egoistic self, but have expanded the radius of the circle with which they tend to identify themselves, tend to lead lives that are characterized by less anxiety, more freedom, and happiness. So how can we achieve this decentering of our viewpoint, this new identification of ourselves? Well, I think basically most spiritual exercises are intended to achieve this goal. Perhaps the main example would be the famous view from above, in which the practitioner imagines herself hovering above her life situation as a detached observer. As she rises higher and higher in this imaginative flight, her perspective broadens from her house and block and neighborhood to her city, region, state, province, country, continent, Earth, and the cosmos as a whole. And as this process of zooming out, which is also an expansion of our horizons, proceeds, our view of the seriousness of our own problems and concerns tends to be lessened or relativized. And I want to argue that most spiritual exercises boil down to this shift in perspective, whether it's the Stoic redefinition and circumscription of things that worry or disgust us, or the Epicurean advice on dealing with the fear of death by redefining our concept of death and what it means to us, a la Wittgenstein. But the spiritual exercises are not the only means of obtaining this shift in perspective. Hadot has pointed to the importance of aesthetic experience. He concentrated on painting, but we could also add music, cinema, dance. Personally, I found that travel helps. The experience of living in a different country where people live in a very different way, but are getting along just quite fine, thank you very much, reminds me that there are other ways of living than my own. I also find, personally, that reading and translating ancient philosophical texts or collating manuscripts can also have a similar decentering effect, because to understand the meaning of an ancient text, we pretty well have to bracket our individualistic selves in order to get into the head, as it were, of the author and attempt to see the world as the author saw it. Now, in this perspective, I think, coincides with some of the views of Edward Said. In Orientalism, Said wrote, the more one is able to leave one's cultural home, the more easily is one able to judge it, and the whole world as well, with the spiritual detachment and generosity necessary for true vision. The more easily, too, does one assess oneself and alien cultures with the same combination of intimacy and distance. And Horacio Herrera has shown that the achievement of this detachment was a kind of spiritual exercise, consisting, and I quote, as in an effort to separate and detach oneself from one's own set of values in order to open up new paths. The asceticism, he also speaks of the asceticism the philologist must apply in order to distance himself from his own affiliations and to be able to reach a deeper understanding of the text he is working on, but above all, to entirely transform his way of seeing the world and himself. And that is just what a spiritual exercise is, according to Hadot. Near the end of his life, in humanistic and democratic criticism, Said called for a return to philology. For Said, truly philological reading, as an attempt to enter inside the process of language, is able to provide humanism with an adequate exercise of its essential value. It consists in the stages of reception and resistance, and I'll concentrate on the stage of reception here. In this, Said writes, we first submit to the text and then proceed to investigate its historical context, observing how attitudes, feelings, and rhetoric are combined with socioeconomically determined historical tendencies and formulations. To do this, the humanist must situate herself in the place of the other, reading the author's works through the latter's eyes, and that means that she must adapt her own viewpoint and adopt that of the ancient author to the limited extent that is possible. For Said, this constitutes what he calls an irreducibly personal act of commitment to reading and interpretation, the gesture of reception, which includes the process of opening up to the text. And it's in this context that Said remarks that some forms of expression popular among academics of his time were, in his view, anti-democratic and even anti-intellectual because of their excessive use of jargon. Said quotes the example of readers of the Quran. They begin their effort to reach the depths of the sacred text by understanding its literal meaning, and here they can call upon the help of traditional chains of interpretation. Still, according to Said, each such reading includes what he calls an element of personal commitment, an extraordinary effort called ijtihad, which Said elsewhere defines as the central role of the individual in the study and interpretation. And one can compare perhaps a recent remark by Mathieu Terrier in the context of Shiite thought, where he defines ijtihad as an effort of intellectual interpretation of the non-rational traditions of the Imams. So for the later Said, as for Pierre Hadot, philological practice is a spiritual exercise by means of which the reader assumes the persona of an ancient author, again, to the limited extent possible, bracketing her own vanity and self-centeredness. Once again, as in Greco-Roman spiritual exercises, the goal is to shift one's perspective by detaching oneself from one's own values and affiliations in order to open oneself to the perspective of an author who may be situated far away from us in time and space. For both Said and Hadot, the goal is to rise to a kind of universal perspective corresponding to a higher degree of objectivity. And the result of this process would thus be a kind of a dialectic between objectivity, achieved by bracketing our egocentric individualistic self, and the resulting new subjectivity, which is in turn capable of feeding back to and transforming the subject in the direction of a higher degree of universality, rationality, and openness to others. I want to conclude briefly with a discussion of Avicenna. Was Avicenna a rationalist philosopher or a mystic? And this will allow me to discuss a little bit the question of what qualifies this. We've spoken about decoloniality, but what qualifies as colonialist thought? Could one describe as colonialist an approach that consists in a contemporary Western scholar imposing her own conceptual schemes on an ancient Islamic thinker, interpreting the latter's work only as a function of those conceptual schemes, cherry-picking evidence that confirms the scholar's interpretation, and finally, ignoring or disregarding as irrelevant whatever evidence from the Islamic thinker's extant works might tend to contradict that interpretation? Let's take as an example Dimitri Gutas' interpretation of Avicenna. Needless to say, one of the greatest living scholars in the Islamic world, and probably the most influential. Now, for Gutas, Ibn Sina is essentially exclusively a rationalist and an empiricist, and he rather violently rejects the implication that Ibn Sina may have been any kind of a quote-unquote mystic, although as far as I can tell, Gutas never really defines what he means by a mystic. And in Gutas' argumentation, evidence that tends to point in another direction, such as the last books of the Isharat, mystical treatises such as the Risala fil Ishq, the treatise on love, are dismissed as temporary aberrations. For instance, We know that Ibn Sina's work called The Oriental Wisdom is now lost, except for a few fragments. And as far as this loss is concerned, Gutas writes as following: the concept of Avicenna's Eastern philosophy is a non-issue. Its significance lies in displaying his attitude toward his work during a specific and limited period of his career. The loss of the fair judgment is deplorable only to the extent that we have been deprived of the opportunity to admire more instances of the acuity and perspicacity with which a great mind confronted another through the incrustations of 13 centuries of philosophical history. So here we see that the value of Avicenna, basically, for Gutas, is to get rid of all this nonsense that's been going on for the past 1300 years and go back to the true, pure meaning of Aristotle. It seems awfully reminiscent of some kind of a fundamentalism in this context. And I think that we can see that we're more or less where Gutas is coming from. He has, for his own reasons, decided beforehand that Avicenna's philosophy just is that which is set forth in the more rationalistic parts of the Shifa. And as a result, any evidence to the contrary must be discarded, even though for Ibn Sina himself, at least at the time he wrote notes on the theology of Aristotle, the Oriental wisdom was so important that he instructs the reader to consult it on important points like post-mortem existence or the question of the union between the human and divine intellect almost a dozen times. So he himself, Ibn Sina, seems to have thought that it was kind of important. Now let's contrast this with another approach to Ibn Sina, which is that of Yahya Michot. Michot writes that for Ibn Sina, any power of the human being's essence can be actualized only when the lower dimensions of her existence, such as the imagination, participate in her spiritual project. And this requires an intimate correspondence between all levels of a human being's activity. And Michot in this context cites the Isharat, the last books of the Isharat, on the importance of spiritual exercises, which is how he translates Riyada. Ibn Sina writes that these have three main goals. The first is to remove from the domain of preference that which is on this side of the real. The second is to distract the powers of the imagination and the estimative from the images of lower things by directing them toward images corresponding to holy things. And finally, to refine the secret of the heart with a view to awakening. This goal, writes Ibn Sina, is promoted by subtle thought and a chaste love. Now, obviously, passages like these with their overtly Sufi tonalities don't fit with the Gutasian paradigm of an exclusively rationalist Ibn Sina. Instead, coming from the last chapters of a work Ibn Sina wrote late in life and regarded as his crowning accomplishment, they show us a thinker who is deeply aware, as was Hadot, of the fact that spiritual or philosophical progress requires the mobilization not only of ratiocination, but of the totality of the human individual, including such allegedly inferior modalities as the emotions and the imagination. As for Hadot, once again, the goal of this spiritual process is not merely to be able to solve philosophical problems by reasoning clearly and using logically valid arguments, but to practice spiritual exercises which, in the words of Michot, will lead as their goal to the essential integration of the individual within the dynamic university of the universe. And I think that this formulation could perfectly well serve as a definition of what Hadot calls cosmic consciousness as the goal of spiritual exercises. So, summing up, how can we characterize and evaluate this contrast, if there's anything to it, between Gutas and Michot? Well, every scholar has an axe to grind. Every scholar approaches her subject matter already endowed with a specific set of presuppositions, preferences, and prejudices, originating in extraordinarily complex interweavings of nature and culture, upbringing, education, and genetic predispositions. This is true not only of Gutas, but of me, of Hadot, of Michot, of Henri Corbin, and of everybody else. The ideal of pure objectivity in research is largely, if not completely, a mirage. Yet, personally, I can't help but think that there's still a difference between the approaches of Gutas and Michot. Gutas's ideal of philosophy is, it seems to me, a kind of Procrustean bed, and he is willing to bend, twist, and perhaps even mutilate even Sina's thought until it fits with this preconceived ideal. Yet this ideal of what real philosophy is, something purely detached, objective, rational, empirical, completely opposed to anything irrational and quote-unquote mystical, is itself a historical construction. And Hadot's work has shown that this notion of philosophy, this conception of philosophy, is a fairly recent historical development. Although it had antecedents in Plato and Aristotle, it did not really emerge fully fledged until the early modern period with Descartes. And I suspect it may not be a historical accident that the kind of philosophy Gutas takes as his implicit ideal looks very much like the rational empiricism of Locke and Hume, which was itself made possible by European colonialism at its most brutal. So in this sense, Gutas is forcing even Sina's thought into the straitjacket of an anachronistic, exclusively rationalist, post-17th century Western model of philosophy may well represent an instance of colonialism. Now, of course, the question that then arises is the following. And most of these questions were already raised and incipiently answered by Sajjad in his opening comments. Is the application to Islamic thought of any interpretive model, devised by a contemporary European or North American, including Pierre Hadot, also, ipso facto, an instance of colonialism? Secondly, are there degrees in the spectrum leading from colonialism to decoloniality? If there are, by what criteria should we judge specific Western-inspired interpretative models, and who is to do the judging? I don't have no answers to any of these questions, but can do no better than submit them to the judgment of my audience, almost all of whom are better versed in such matters than I am. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mike. I think, although we are running slightly late, I think we should have a few minutes for any questions or any comments. So if anyone here has any, or if anyone on Zoom has anything to say, can you please put your hand up and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself. Any questions, any comments at all? No, yes. I mean, I think in many ways it's setting up what we're going to be discussing anyway, so perhaps we will come back to them, and it's actually quite useful to raise these key questions. Okay, please. Yes, yes.
In what way do you differentiate or compare decolonialism to post-colonialism?
Right. The question is, how do we differentiate between decoloniality and post-colonialism?
My answer is that I have no idea. I am not an expert on this field, and I will defer to everyone else in this room who knows more about this than I do.
I think there are a couple of hands up on Zoom, but I can't. Oh, right. Okay.
Mohammed Ismaili.
Ismaili, do you have we'll come back to that. Mohammed Ismaili, you have a question?
Thank you so much, Mike, for your invaluable presentation. It was very interesting that you made a critical point of view on Gutas and Michot, but I'm sure that you have your own interpretation of Avicenna, which might illuminating our idea. I would like to ask you if you have some general idea about the topic, or maybe you prefer later you have some clarification of this approach. If it is possible in general way, it is highly appreciated to not rely on what Gutas or Michot says, but your own view, because I'm sure you are a great thinker that have your invaluable idea about this.
Well, I'm sorry to contradict you, my friend Mohammed. I'm certainly not a great thinker, and I'm certainly not in the same league as an interpreter of Avicenna with someone like Gutas. However, my overall impression is that what may have happened is that that even Sina started off his career as a fully convinced Aristotelian. He thought Aristotle had all the answers, and that's what he dedicated the Shifa to setting forth. But it can be that as he evolved, as he grew older, as he had more contacts with people, he came to think that there were lacks in this Aristotelian paradigm. One of these lacks, I think, is the problem that in Aristotelian science, the Aristotelian doctrine of demonstration leaves no room for the knowledge of individuals. And that's a problem. It's also a problem for providence. Aristotle doesn't believe in providence. Islam does. There are all kinds of shortcomings, I think, that Ibn Sina can have found with Aristotelianism. I believe that later in his life, he came into contact with various Sufi currents, and I believe that in what is more or less his definitive view, if we can speak of such a thing, it comes out looking very close to being a form of philosophical Sufism. So that's basically what would be the short answer to that. But my views are very temporary and in constant evolution on this subject.
I think that will require another kind of paper at some point. But shall we go to the next question and then we'll come back? There's one more on Zoom.
Yeah, okay, not sure if you can hear me. Did Pierre Hadot and say actually, was there an interaction between the two scholars? And that's a follow-up question. The second question is, did Pierre actually say much about Islam and spiritual exercises? Because reading your article as well on it, I was just wondering a bit more about the role of religion. It does seem that he's touching upon those areas, but it's pretty much missing from his own discussion. Can you say a bit more about the role of religion and probably more specifically about Islam? Or do you have any of these discussions with him? So about what role Islam can play within his worldview of philosophy?
Yes, if I understood the question correctly, as far as Islam is concerned, unless I'm mistaken, Hadot had nothing to say about it whatsoever. It was not his area of specialty, and he simply didn't know very much about it and was not particularly interested. As far as the role of religion is concerned, well, yeah, but that's a whole can of worms, isn't it? Many people write as though it's self-evident what the distinction between religion and philosophy is. It's not self-evident to me. There may be points on which they differ, but when you study, as Hadot did, late Greco-Roman Neoplatonism, gosh, the non-Christian paganism that these thinkers represented begins to look an awful lot like religion, although what ostensibly they're doing is interpreting Plato and Aristotle. So I don't think I don't think the line is quite as easy to trace as it's often made out to be, any more than is the distinction between rationalism and mysticism, whatever that might be.
Okay, let's take Norman's question. Norman.
Hello. Thank you for that really thrilling presentation. Very exciting to hear that critique of Gutas. I have a question about this complex of terms, reason, rationalism, and irrational and irrationalism. Surely spiritual exercises would not have been considered irrational in the past. Yeah.
No.
And nor would people recognize this term rationalism in the past. Reason has come to mean something very different. Surely.
Very good. So, a very key point.
Yeah.
Thank you for raising that point. Yeah, and I think that especially even more so than other languages, English is hindered by the fact that we have really just one word to designate the cognitive process, and that's knowledge. But all Latin languages and Greek and Arabic, I would suggest, also have differences between different words, different terminologies they can use to designate different types of knowledge. Ilm and ma'rifa, it's not the same thing. Savoir and connaître in French, it's not the same thing. There is propositional knowledge, demonstrative knowledge, episteme in Greek, ilm in Arabic, and then there is knowledge by acquaintance, ma'rifa, in Arabic, gnosis in Greek, and they're just not the same things, connaître in French. But English is handicapped by the fact that we can only speak about all these very different kinds of cogitation or cognitive activity by the same word, knowledge. And I think that tends to lead us astray. But you're right, it's essential to study the historical emergence of the concept of rationality, which English-speaking writers today simply take for granted and don't examine, generally speaking.
Thank you. We will come back to your question, but I'm just aware that we should perhaps move on to the next speaker, who is Paul Balanfa. So Paul, are you out there so I can introduce you? Oh, there you are. Okay. Right, so it's a pleasure to introduce our second speaker today, Paul Balanfa. I first actually met Paul in Iran over 20 years ago. But when I was a grad student, and he was already a very well-established specialist on Sufism. In particular, he has a wonderful article on Sufism